How you doing?
How am I doing? I mean, personally, pretty well. Can't really complain too much, but trying to make sense of a world that is spiraling into chaos faster than I thought was possible.
Yeah, it's hard to tell what the hell's going on. It seems like a very positive and a very negative thing are happening simultaneously, and also an extremely weird thing is dominating all of it.
Yeah. The weird thing being the virus.
I have a kind of cartoonish metaphysical view of the weird thing as being an intrinsic factor, like as if weirdness itself was encroaching into history.
Oh, sure, like Eric Davis style.
Yeah. So that the virus is just one sign that there's going to be these, whether it's true or just hypothetical, increasing waves of mass feeling that the situation is extremely ambiguous and peculiar, and we don't know exactly what to do, and it's going like this all the time.
Yeah. I guess this is what Gebser described, as the interim sort of breakdown before a new mutation. It's definitely weird. 2020 has been, it's only half over, right? And it's just one thing after the next. I'm starting to expect more weirdness. Weirdness is becoming the norm. So yeah, I'm with you on that. I'm definitely I like Eric Davis's notion of like weird realism. That seems to be fitting for this time between worlds, between attractor basins that organize our consciousness. It feels very slippery right now, and there's opportunity to leap forward and plenty of opportunity to fall back, to regress.
I think the opportunity is connected in some way to having this view of this sort of meta-cyclic view of time, where you're not just caught in the local cycle, right? Where we're not just, if you look at the situation and they go, hey, it's COVID, hey, it's economic collapse, hey, it's Black Lives Matter. If you just stare at each one and talk about each one, you miss the fact there's going to be an equally or bigger weird one in a few weeks. And so you don't really get a grasp on what the situation is. And that parallels, in my mind, the jump from modern to progressive politics. Right, the way the modern system is set up is this week's news story, this month's automobile, this election cycle. You're supposed to morally obey the current cycle. But in order to see what's going on, what's accumulating, you've got to look between the cycles and stop being so emotionally engaged in what's currently going on, because something else is going to go on next. And that's the framework, I think, from which progressive politics is trying to take its stand.
Right. Yeah, I mean, just in terms of the media environments that go along with this, like modern consciousness had a narrative form because mass media was still in charge of the information flow, and now with social media, it's a very non-linear and multi-perspectival sort of. Can we even call it a story anymore? Stories. I guess that's the thing with the postmodern world. You just have to pluralize everything.
Yeah, that's a big piece of it for sure. I mean, in the Marshall McLuhan sense, it's almost seemed like there was going to be this huge jump between, say, newspaper and book culture and TV. But we look back now, and TV and books seem to have a whole bunch in common that the internet doesn't.
Right.
I don't know whether it's just a fragmentation of narrative or whether we're in a process of shifting into something that isn't narrative. Like, I feel like people who lament the absence of a grand narrative and who think the problem is in reestablishing the narrative are a little bit biased in terms of tending to be authors and journalists and people trained at the literary institutions. And the reality might be that there's an underlying process of building up collective spirit that leads to upgrades that creates stories for itself as a side effect as it goes, but doesn't require a story in order to go. And I think there's a kind of passiveness or a danger in sitting back and going, well, we have no story, I guess we can't do anything.
Yeah, Well, but it's, I guess the function of those narratives, those grand narratives, was to form a people too, like a sense of collective identity. And more, the only sense of collective identity that we seem capable of forming, whoever the we is these movements. You know, the social justice movements. Uh, they don't have, typically there's not much of a longer term arc to the story. It's a very, it's now, and we need to take action now for this purpose. And so it's kind of it's like a short story, I guess, rather than a meta narrative. um, and so people are moving from one crisis to the next, you know, trying to be of service without a sense of, you know, what's the bigger picture here, and how can we make change that lasts 100 years instead of one news cycle.
Yeah, I resonate with all that, but I'm tempted to tease apart those two things, right? Like, was the narrative a foundational part of establishing people in their cultures, or was it like the fruit growing on the tree? Was it a later effect? And they were actually mobilized to longer range changes through some kind of collective behavioral protocol that didn't need to tell itself a story and only create a story later or over a long period of time as a additional adornment to itself. And
Yeah.
that maybe people, you know, say had they have a little short story, there's something definitely problematic about replacing culture with fragmentary and temporary movements that have a limited time frame and look more like pre-modern than postmodern.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe what they're lacking is not the arc of a long story so much as the practices that would give them the energy that inherently moves on those longer tempos.
Mm. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. I don't think cultures that had meta narratives could articulate what the narrative was. Yeah, that's why it's meta. It's like metaphysics is always what's sort of so obvious that you don't even bother to mention it and you don't even notice it. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
I mean, we have a sort of historical fallacy, I think, where we want to make a change. Like, remember how the Christians toppled the Roman Empire, right? But we look back and we think they knew they were Christians, when really there were hundreds of years where that name didn't really apply. They were just putting it together bit by bit. They were active. It was working. It accomplished something over a long frame, but they didn't know about themselves what we think about them now. So it's not a process where somebody gets the great idea and goes out and starts persuading people, and then they get on board with the idea. I think it's something more basic, more organic is missing first. And I think a lot of the problem in trying to get change going is we're trying to start at a place that's further down the line than we need to start. We've got to start in a much more basic, organic spot somehow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that. So, thanks for taking the time to chat. I've really enjoyed every conversation I have seen you in. I even dug into some of your writing last night, and I read an essay. It's probably 10 years ago that you wrote on Eros and evolution for, I guess, Integral World. Is that what that website's called? Great stuff. I didn't realize. I still don't realize the scope of what you've done over the years, but everything I've seen, I really appreciated, and I feel a sense of resonance with the style, not just what you think, but how you think it, the style of your thought. So
it's nice to hear. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So I thought, especially in light of your recent dialogues with Brent Cooper, that you and I might have some interesting things to talk about. And we've already been exploring a bit already, but we could continue what we've been talking about. Is there a particular sort of nexus that you think would be most fruitful for us to explore, or should we just kind of?
I'm certain that what we've already started saying sort of characterizes the flavor of the conversation we'll have. I'm sure whatever's been on each of our minds very recently is going to work its way into the conversation. But let's touch in on that paper you linked me to, because I would love to explore the nexus of theology, ecology, economics, and politics. Where do those things come together?
Right. Yeah. Well, thanks for taking the time to take a look at that. That was Something that I wrote for a graduate course about, I guess that was in 2012. So I think if I were approaching the intersection of those things, religion, politics, economics, now, I might do it a little bit differently. But I was kind of doing an experiment there to see if from, trying to fully inhabit a sort of esoteric Christian worldview, how might that be marshaled in service of economic critique and reconstruction of a more ecological culture? And I've never heard from any Christians that they read it and were like, "Wow, I'm totally on board." So I don't know if that experiment succeeded, but it's still a sort of approach that I consider myself a religious pluralist, but most people on the planet today are not. And so I think there's a way in which, if there is going to be any form of planetary transformation, it's going to flow through those religious impulses, probably through the given wisdom traditions that we have been given and inherited. Those are the molds that I think are going to, if human energy can be channeled, it's going to flow through those molds, I think, at least at this moment in history. Who knows, in the distant future, new things will be possible. But so for me, when we look at economics, if we only criticize it as, in the terms that modern economists have set, as though it's just like economics is just a technology that we use to make exchange more efficient or something. Like there's no morality, there's no underlying cultural like worldview stuff. It's just this is a technique, and capitalism seems to be the best technique. And so let's examine it in a dispassionate way, and with the underlying assumption that capitalism is the best we can do, backgrounding all of the moral, really the theology that goes into the capitalist worldview, that doesn't usually get acknowledged in an academic economics course, or on the news when they talk about the economy. And so I was trying to surface the way that, look, economics isn't just a positive science. It used to be called moral theology for a reason, right? And somehow it got separated out from morality and religion. And I think we actually, to make progress critiquing capitalism and articulating an alternative, we need to bring economics back into what we used to think of as religion, because and we need to change our modern conception of religion as just being about belief. Like all you have to do is say the right words and you're in the club. After death you get to go to heaven. Like that's not what religion in the pre-modern period was. It was a whole comprehensive way of life with practices and community involvement, and it's had certain implications for how we organize a society. And there's a lot of bad stuff with that too, and modernity differentiated all the value spheres, and that's great, but we need to reintegrate this stuff now. So yeah, that's kind of what I was aiming to do in that paper. And it's a project that I've been thinking more about as a potential avenue to continue this work, but I've been curious to hear from others if they think it's viable or not.
Well, there's a couple areas I pick up on in that. First is that I think enhancing moral development is a huge piece of this. It's a huge piece of our politics. It's a huge piece of how our economy runs. And it's a really weak spot in the developmental models, which overemphasize the cognitive recognition of patterns and don't put moral self-inspection at the core of what development means. So there's that piece. I think there's a sense in which you're right that established traditions, especially at large scale, are a major place that we have to look for change to be organized, especially if we think of people as existing at these different epistemic levels. But we also have to include the people who aren't in the traditions as if they're a tradition, in the sense that the biggest voting bloc is non-voters. Like, they're huge too, right? And I think they have to be a legit player at that table. And the other thing is, what is an advanced view of what religion is and what the sacred is in terms of how it plays a role in the world? I've done a lot of rethinking about my assumptions about what religion consists of. Because I have a tendency, well, modern people have a tendency to think of mythic membership religion as the definition, right? As if religion consists primarily of 5 or 6 very large, well-known groups where you verbally profess allegiance to a book and a cosmology. And that's what modernity thinks it's separating itself from. But it actually enshrines that idea of religion by saying that's what it's separating itself from. And what I think is that model is not characteristic of human religion in general. It's characteristic of mythic membership structures in general. That's how politics is done. That's how family is done. That's how everything is done in the amber blue pre-modern system. So if you extract religion out of that and say that's just mythic membership religion, then what does religion look like in all the other systems? What should modern religion look like? What should postmodern religion look like? What did archaic religion look like? And what were they doing? What are the people after belief religion supposed to do? And what were the people before belief religion doing? And I think we probably have to argue it as a kind of process of post-metaphysical production, right? That they were doing something together that created an experience that they referred to as sacred because it was so useful and wonderful to them. And they needed it in order to secure their identity and allow them to take action. And if that element, if the production of the numinous is not operating because the subsystems of our current environment are not cooperating in the way they need to cooperate in order to make the sacred, then we don't have that extra energy and meaning, so we can't mobilize on that extra energy and meaning. If all we have is the energy and meaning that's consistent with operating in the current system, then we don't have enough to upgrade the system. To upgrade the system, we need more than what we need in order to persist. And that extra, that sense of something that goes beyond what we are, the transcendental experience, whether personally or collectively, has to really be promulgated. We have to succeed at understanding what that function is so that we have the bonus energy and confidence and meaning to mobilize on answers that by and large we've already figured out. There's not a lot of mystery about climate situation and the kinds of general political and economic shifts we need to make at the minimum level of depressurizing and stabilizing our system, right? There's massive agreement on a lot of those things. People have been working them out for a long time. We're not embodying or enacting them for some reason. The juice we need is missing. So I tend to think of religion as like a social machinery for producing that. And where it's not working, I would just say that's the religion is failing. It's not doing its job. It starts to become a museum of religion instead of a religion, where you go to a building and they go, remember that time in the ancient past in a distant land when people were doing religion? Oh yeah, those were great times. Here's a picture of what it looked like when some other people in a distant country long ago were doing religion. But we're not doing it now. We're going to a museum and hearing about when it was done. So what were they actually doing in their world space at their technological level with their ethnic situation that we could do at our level in our world space that would get the same kind of world historical energy underway?
I love that. I love that sense of religion as a process by which surplus energy is produced in a society. You know, when I look at the history of religion, it seems like it's rooted in ritual. Nowadays, when you see the remnant of ritual in, the Catholic Church is more ritualistic than Protestant churches typically. But there's like the sacrament is so, it's all belief based, like this is transubstantiation and it's a dogma that you believe in. But I mean, how many people feel it? How many people are actually being transformed by the Eucharist? Maybe a few, but it doesn't seem to be a living ritual anymore. Whereas if you look at one of the things I'm really interested in archaeologically, and I assume that the archaeological evidence we have is very fragmentary and the stories we try to piece together out of the evidence we have are likely wrong. But there's this temple in modern day Turkey Gobleki Tepi, I believe is how you pronounce it. Have you heard about this?
Göbekli Tepe, yeah. It's
Yes.
old.
It's very old. It's older than agriculture, it seems. And so it sort of it twists the typical narrative of, that human cultural evolution was predominantly driven by economic factors and population and whatever. But this says, and then religion followed later, after we got the agriculture going. But this suggests that actually the building of a temple and all the ritual practices that went along with it may have been the reason we wanted to settle, and that creating an agricultural society may have initially been for the purposes of serving this ritual play that went on in the temples. So it totally shifts our understanding of human evolution, I think, if we put ritual play at the origin as this thing that we discovered that produces this surplus energy, that everything else sort of orbits around that, rather than everything orbiting around new technologies like domesticating animals or agriculture, or whatever. That came as a side effect. So I think that all of a sudden it's a less materialistic view of human evolution that allows us to see the ways in which our human energy, we could call it psychic energy or spiritual energy, whatever. And I'm speaking metaphorically. It's not like an actual force or something, but it's something that we generate through these collective ritual practices. And I think there's something about what we call play nowadays, and the state of consciousness associated with play that facilitates a kind of transcendence of just mere biological toil, and like something new becomes possible. And it seems to me that we're not utilizing this ancient ritual technology in a way that could really revitalize our sense of what it means to be human today. It's not just an archaic thing for superstitious animists or whatever, these modern anthropological constructs that we project onto the past, because we're still doing all that now. We're just unconscious of it. We're commodity animists. We think all these machines around us are magical. Meanwhile, they're destroying the third world, and we're stealing their resources, and all the pollution and the social cost of these magical technologies is out of our view. So we're animists too. We think cars just run when you turn the ignition on, and once in a while you fill it up at the gas station, but we background the effects of our really superstitious animist belief in the magic of machines. So anyways, I think we just need to become more conscious of the way that human energy can be cultivated and channeled by these ritual technologies. And I think there's still a lot of potential in the religious traditions, the wisdom traditions that we have today. They may seem like empty shells right now, but it's like the whole cockpit is still there. Like all the buttons are still there. We just forgot how to use them,
Yeah, I think we need to realize we need to have a better proprioceptive and imaginative capacity to understand what those buttons were for, what we might have been doing. And I think in a way, the grid we've used to cut up the different genres of culture has made us think that a lot of things that are religious aren't religious because we put religion over in a particular zone. I think it's probably more like philosophy, like it's the mother of the genres. When all the genres of society come together, then it starts to look religious, because we have this, it's like you're saying, the animism thing. A sun worshiper is not somebody who goes around praising Helios. A sun worshiper is a guy who has a barbecue when the sun comes out in the summer. It's a ritual observance relative to a force of nature, and it gives him a sense of overwhelming meaningfulness that he didn't get during the week.
Right.
It's recreation, but it's recreational, right? I'm going to go to the park with my family and camp out for a while, and I need to, and I do it every year, and it gives me something that I don't get in the rest of my life. So there's a basic process everyone's engaged in, but they don't recognize it as sacred. They think of it as trivial or colloquial. But I think our ancestors didn't make that distinction the way we do. They had a much more straightforward relationship to these things. And the Göbekli Tepi hypothesis, where the religion comes first before the agriculture and domestication, makes tremendous sense to anybody who has any personal experience of shamanism, right? You've only had to have one drug trip in the woods or some kind of mystical epiphany, and somebody goes, look at this feather, and you go, wow, right? We should come back and check on this feather every year. It's very straightforward to sacralize your environment under certain conditions and to mobilize around that as a codified form of your access to the numinous. It's extremely straightforward. It's bizarre that a lot of anthropologists and historians didn't take that seriously before. It probably due to their own lack of that kind of experience. But it seems extremely straightforward and natural for a broadly experienced human being.
Right, right. What brought home for me the way that the postmodern world, I guess, has debased and misunderstood religion, and that these various parts of culture as a whole have been so fragmented and now they're being remixed, is like, so as when I was in college, I used to work in a food court at a mall, and every Sunday they would hold church in the movie theater. And I had never, it just clicked for me, like, what American society has done to the religious impulse. These people would go into the movie theater, and the reverend would say whatever he says about how they should hate gay people and that the earth is too big for us to ever do any damage to it, whatever they talked about. And then the people would come get their coffee and they'd go shopping. And that's the American religion. We only call the church part religion, but in fact, like, all of that, the whole shopping mall is the new church. Why even build a separate church when you can just have your religious observance in the mall itself? And it started to click for me then as an undergraduate, studying anthropology and the history of religion. Like, I was seeing the fragmentation and the remixing of all of this every Sunday when I would go to work serving these people their coffee. And the urgency of the need to sort of snap people out of this zombified version of what it means to be religious just hit me. And I realized that, for all these people who nominally refer to themselves and think of themselves as Christians, which that's, by far the dominant religion in the United States, they're not actually practicing the religion in the way that it would be intended for it to be transformative. Not just individually, but socially and collectively. And so it struck me then, I have like a mixed background. I didn't attend church like regularly as a kid or anything. My mom's Christian and my dad's Jewish, and I had sort of turned away from religion until I recognized that there's just no escape from it in terms of how it shapes our society. So as an undergrad, when I had this realization, I realized I needed to, if there was hope for the transformation of our society, it would need to flow through this religious impulse. And so I've been, for more than a decade now, trying to find ways to engage with religious believers. I almost said traditional religious believers, but there's nothing traditional about modern religion. Like fundamentalism, evangelical Christianity, these are all very modern inventions. Like you were saying earlier, modernity sort of looked at religion and thought it was separating itself from it, but it was actually excreting something out of itself, which was very new, which is this whole notion of religion as just being belief-based. I don't think it was belief-based at all for most of human history. It was practice-based. It wasn't about what you believed, it was about what you did. One of the things that is very positive that's happened in the last several years, I think, is the way that, and he's meeting a lot of resistance, but Pope Francis, with his encyclical, has been trying to shift this giant, to turn this giant ship in a slightly different direction by drawing on biblical resources, and the tradition, like going back to the original St. Francis, of a form of Christianity that's more creation-centric, and that recognizes the role of human beings as caretakers of creation, right? Rather than this is just a temporary pit stop here on planet Earth and our real destiny is somewhere else. I think for the Pope, I wish he wasn't meeting as much resistance from the more conservative elements within the Catholic Church, and I wish he didn't also have to deal with the rampant sexual abuse that moves through that whole institution. But it was at least a positive sign that something different is possible within, one of the oldest, largest, most powerful religious institutions in the West. What the longer term consequences of his encyclical will be remains to be seen, but it was at least a positive sign that, oh wow, this could actually happen from the inside. I don't know if the Catholic Church can continue to function positively just because of all the sexual abuse stuff. I mean, that's a whole nother can of worms, but Christianity itself, I don't think, needs to take institutional form, and it actually might be more powerful if it was able to escape the institutional forms, because what toppled Rome? Not an institution. you know it was a mode of consciousness, and I think that there is, and it's obviously Islam too has still a powerful hold over billions of people, and can be in Muslim majority countries, there's not a sense of separation between religion and politics and economics. It's all still compact, and that's dangerous. But on the other hand, with the West having fragmented everything, I think the modern West assumes that we've teased religion out of economics and politics, but I think more and more people are realizing that that's just a story we've been telling ourselves, and maybe we've won some freedoms that follow from the distinction between church and state, but in reality, like, look at all these politicians. They have to at least profess nominal belief, if not most of them on the Republican side, govern from this very fundamentalist understanding of what religion is. So yeah, in any event, we're in a post-secular age, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, and we need to re-engage with these religions as consciously as we can, and not take that attitude that modern intellectuals have for so long of just being like, that was the childhood of humanity and now we're adults, so we don't need to do that anymore. That's not viable, right?
I think that attitude, I mean, there's a lot of difference and a lot of continuity between pre-modern and modern religion.
Yeah.
There's the traditional religion was not book-based, but it did involve professing belief in the group symbols. When it shifted to modernity, it became more individualized, and religion was more like something the individual writes down on a piece of paper that says, what is your religion? But there is still a lot of continuity there. Where was I going with that?
Yeah.
What was the last thing you said?
That religion isn't just from the childhood of humanity.
Yeah. So here's the continuity part: is the monotheisms had a lot of that pejorative attitude about the pre-monotheisms, as if that was the childhood of humanity, right? So the Greeks had a word for God, which was Zeus, where we get deus and deity from, right? But the Christian and Muslim scholars acted like that was the name of a cartoon deity that those childlike, innocent people worshiped before they understood about God.
Yeah.
Right. But if you actually translated the word rather than leaving it in Greek, it would sound like, oh, they worshiped God, and that's how they dealt with it. Mm-hmm. So I think the secular era inherits a lot of the monotheistic assumptions about the pre-monotheistic people and just adds the monotheists to that whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of continuity in this pejorative thing about the different stages of how we relate to society and faith. And I think that's largely what we have to get over and kind of put them all on the same playing field, the archaic and indigenous and traditional and modern. And then that's where the postmodern is this opportunity to think of things in a meta-modern or integrative sense as being on the same playing field, except it just... maybe postmodernism is the word for just starting to do that process rather than having had some success in that process.
Yeah.
I think the differentiation of the value spheres is an easy thing to misread, because in traditional societies, those genres of society, like you were saying about Islam, they're very closely packed together. It's easy to grasp them as an aesthetic totality, and it's easy to see why people could get that sense of overwhelming numinous power because all those things are packed together, but they weren't perfectly overlaid on each other. There was still a little bit of interactive space between those genres. Now, modernity doesn't cleave them apart, even if it says it did that. It spaces them out further. It didn't get rid of church and state. It just gave them a little more breathing room.
Mm-hmm.
But what it needs to do is grow into the spaces between that. And then postmodernity goes, hey, each one of those things is actually 50 things. But then it's got to grow into those spaces between them as well. So we haven't really separated them. We just haven't filled in the spaces as well as our ancestors did. And it's understandable they had less space to fill in. But we could do a similar move in order to create sacredness at our level. Because one of the things when you were saying like the mall cult, what's the failure of contemporary religion? Is it a failure relative to a higher perspective where you look back at modernity from a postmodern viewpoint and go, modernity's religion is insufficient to my postmodern viewpoint? Or is there something succeeding and failing at each of those levels? And you go, this is modern religion and modernity needs a religiousness. Why is this version of modern religiousness not succeeding? What is it not doing that successful instances of religion were doing? And that's kind of I would say that's very Nietzschean, that Nietzsche tried to look at what the health dimension was of our belief systems and our value systems, right? And where say Christianity was empowering people in their lives, that's one thing. Where Christianity is saying, hey, all the meaning exists somewhere else, or when you're dead, then that's a disempowering version of the same setup. So that every tradition and modernity and postmodernity looks to me as if there's a more integrated, more healthy version of it, and a less integrated, less healthy, and even nihilistic, self-destructive version of it.
Right. Yeah, because, at least with the shopping mall as the center of worship in our modern capitalist society, we could worship together. But now that the shopping malls are all closed down and Amazon has replaced them, it's like the Protestantization of the shopping mall religion. It's all become individualized and we shop from home. But the whole notion of, like, I'm curious to see if there are patterns that don't actually change all that much through time. They just take on different clothing. And so there's a ritual performance that's playing out when people would go to the shopping mall. And it's funny now. It's like I almost feel like I'm talking about a previous era, because I am, right? Like
back in my day.
Or like going to a movie. It's a collective ritual performance of some kind that grants us membership into a certain kind of society. It's a form of participation, and these capitalist structures and ritual performances and technologies are beginning to break down. And what's going to replace them? Something as basic as like, you and Brent were talking about money. Money, I think, anthropologically, it's a means of communication, and we don't so much understand the meaning of money so much as we participate in flows of this numinous mana that organizes our lives in ways that are ultimately mysterious. But we feel chosen if we are wealthy, and we feel that we're sinners if we're poor. This is how the whole economy functions at this religious level. So that but more and more people are realizing, wait, if I'm poor, it's not my fault. It's the system's fault, right? And so the system's legitimacy is breaking down. The god of the market is no longer considered to be good by all who partake in this society, right? And so it's almost like we are killing God again, and there's no alternative basin of attraction yet to pull us forward into a new mode of collective ritual participation. That seems to be the postmodern condition right now.
Yeah. On the one hand, we may not have the energy yet to find the attractor. On the other hand, the attractor may look something like progressive politics with an additional conservative flavor added to it. Right? There's a lot of people trying to feel out where that attractor might be, because a lot of people are in fact mobilized and have a lot of coherence and convergence in their thoughts. When I think about this difference between health and unhealth in the religiosity of any given civilization operating system, one of the things that stands out to me is every one of the levels or stages or epistemes can't really sort itself out. It can't tell its own healthy from unhealthy versions very well. And that kind of requires another unfoldment to emerge, right? You could have a great archaic tribal society. And if they were always in their best possible mode, that would be like an idyllic situation we might all aspire to be in. But the problem is they so frequently went out of their good mode into bizarre self-destructive modes whose traumas we're still inheriting that they can't be relied on. The traditions can't be relied on to stay healthy, and modernity can't either, because it has, in addition to the fact that every system can't really keep itself from breaking down and requires a meta level to do that, modernity has this incentivized competition element. Not that competition is problematic, but the subsystems of modernity tend to be incentivized to parasitize and attack each other, leading to frequent breakdowns in the modern system, which have only either led to temporary regressions, like the Nazi Germany thing, or temporary progressive patch-ups, like the New Deal. So modernity is, I think, inherently self-destabilizing. It can't be relied on to solve any of its problems. It's always going to go at itself and start to fall apart and either produce regression or require an advancement. So that's where we are. And I think the reason we need to double down on progressive or meta-progressive politics is modernity can't be relied upon to stabilize itself. It just won't. It will always start pulling its own wires out. So we need some kind of attractor and the energy to find that attractor. But a big part of that is a critique and a distance from our embedding in the modern system. And a lot of the things we take for granted might turn out to be part of our embedding in that system that keeps it going, even when it destabilizes itself. Like everybody just needs an arbitrary word to define themselves so people can come together on the left. They kind of know what that means. At the same time, that's a subdivision of the modern articulation of what politics is, a conventional spectrum whose left and right keep its status quo going in cycle after cycle. So we have to be careful about thinking where we are in its terms. But almost every form of analysis we have is contaminated with modernity's terms and its concept set that keeps our action revolving back around its attractor basin.
Yeah, I've really been feeling the need to stop the left-right polarization of politics and that whole way of thinking about things. As much as I want to avoid being, there's something about transpartisanship or not being clear where you stand on the actually existing political spectrum that worries me too, though, because I do think, there are clear policy proposals that would be helpful right now that are usually considered left. And so I don't want to say we need to stop bickering and the right and the left have equal, validity. And I don't want to go in that, both sides sort of direction with it. But at the same time, if we keep rehashing the French Revolution and the way that politics got, sort of divvied up in that period, then we're not going to be able to move forward. And so we do need sometimes I wonder if just adding another axis to the political spectrum so that, we've got left or right in terms of, a sense of how the economy should be organized, right being more capitalist, left being more socialist, and then another axis that would usually you'll see these with the authoritarianism and libertarianism as the other axis. I think that works better because then you at least short circuit the typical, American Republican or conservative response, which is that anything to their left is authoritarian communism, because there's actually libertarian socialism on the other bottom part of that left side of the spectrum, which might be more appealing to a lot of people on the right. Rather than saying socialism means government ownership over the means of production, socialism means worker ownership. You know, it's powers distributed among workers. It's not all held by some centralized government. So there are different models, but it's just so polarized right now. Often when I talk about libertarian socialism, which is a school of thought that I have studied and appreciate, coming out of like Murray Bookchin and others, it's closer to anarchism than it is to Marxism, I would say. But when the average centrist or right-wing person hears libertarian socialism, they hear oxymoron, self-contradiction. What are you even talking about? And so we have a real problem with, I think, the political imagination in the United States, I don't know about elsewhere, has just become so shrunken and shriveled. And, you know, it's why I think the religious impulse might be a better source for the transformation we need, not to artificially separate religion and politics, but the political discourse is just so fucking frustrating right now. And it's like, I just feel like we need to get below that to this more like visceral, practical, like ritual dimension of how we make meaning, rather than arguing up here about these political constructs.
Whatever system is currently in control has a vested interest in keeping the disagreements at a superficial level.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another way in which we might be under the sway of the modern attractor, and that polarization itself might be a standard function of modernity in the sense, right? We think of it as current, but modernity always makes you think of the recent fad of this year's light bulb versus next year's light bulb. And we're in these little time bubbles, but it's been using a logic of, right, it invented electricity with positive and negative poles. It went with a prosecutor-defender model of justice. It went with a two official parties model of politics, right? It is the creditor and the debtor. These polarized systems are intrinsic to the machinery that modernity sets up, because when it sets up this duplicity, it creates a flow, and that flow is available for people to profit off, to skim off, or to turn the water wheel, or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. So I think polarization is in many respects par for the course of liberal modernity, of which conservative liberal modernity is a subset.
Yeah.
So I think we need a deep and rich critique of what that is in order to separate ourselves from it to some degree. But I also think that we need two types of solutions that are somehow comparable to the lower left and lower right on an integral grid. Right? One is the cultural solution, which is inherently something like religionization at our current level of knowledge and social values. The other one is a change to the actual systems, the protocols by which we collectively decide on things and then implement them. Both of those were held up in because we're not getting enough new spirit to enfold people and put them on the same page. There's almost no nation spirit shared among the people in the nations around the world. And at the same time, even when 90% of the citizens agree, that doesn't turn into policy. So, well, there's situations in which it doesn't matter that everybody is basically in agreement, because the system is designed in such a way that it doesn't uptake the popular will.
Right.
So upgrading the systemics and deepening the intersubjective spirit have got to happen simultaneously. And they may have to happen somewhat indirectly at first. I'm not sure. I mean, how many times in the Roman Empire did you see a cross and not know what it meant for centuries before there was a church? There's a sort of obliqueness to the initial marketing phase, let's say, right? And it's okay for people to wonder, to not know what it means, and to be vexed. You mentioned libertarian socialism. I've heard people say libertarian eco-socialism, and they don't know what it means, but that's good. They shouldn't know what it means, right? It's not doing its job unless it seems oxymoronic and troubling to them. Mm-hmm. I think there's a whole spirit of the frontier edges of the modern political spectrum turning against the modern center and trying to make a new center. right? And without saying that the modern, it's not both sidism, because the two sides of the modern spectrum are not equal in their policy proposals or their implementation capacity. It makes a big difference who's in there. But we have to get past both of those, and I think we have to turn what modernity calls the far left and what modernity calls the far right into some kind of teamwork that is going to feel incongruous. And we're going to, how can that possibly work? Right? I've been thinking lately about, like, what could Bernie have done to give himself an extra 5 points? Why wasn't it American socialism with the American underlined, right? And that looks incongruous. Nobody's going to be perfectly happy with that, but it claims a space that's normally attributed to a polarization between the sides. It says, no, I'm taking a chunk of both the sides. That's where the new center is. Even if nobody's ready to go there yet, we're off the old spectrum onto a new one.
That's brilliant. American socialism. AOC will have to remember that when she runs for office, for president. But so one of the things that I'm worried about in terms of the situation that liberalism is in is that it is so. I've been reading and listening to some interviews and debates that Alexander Dugin has done. And, it turns out in the 90s, he pretty much predicted how American culture and politics would begin to fray and divide and collapse. And he didn't just predict it. I think he helped prescribe operations that the Russian intelligence agencies could engage in to help precipitate that process. So his critique of liberalism is brilliant. And I agree with his critique of liberalism. It's the religion of the individual, as he describes it. And I do value individuality, obviously, but I see how the individualization of all meaning and the locus of purpose being, all about you, like the me thing. I mean, that's obviously there's no basis for forming a society out of that other than capitalism, but it's not working. We're eating each other alive and the planet. And so I've been feeling this sense of internal dissonance, agreeing with Dugin's critique of liberalism and then looking at his alternative and freaking the fuck out about that as the attractor basin, because he's like, he claims to be critical of communism and fascism as well as these other modern sort of political attractors. But when I hear him describe his so-called fourth political theory, and when I see the influences on him, it's a bunch of fascists. So it sounds pretty fascist to me. And so my concern is, given the critique of liberalism being so right on, what are the alternatives to what Dugin is proposing? Which, when he talks about it, he's a very postmodern, he calls himself a postmodern traditionalist, I guess, which is, this idea that he just wants to value plurality and wants a multipolar world where there are ethno-states where the population within each state has its own version of reality, basically, and we all agree to live and let live, I guess. But he's very Nietzschean also in the sense that if one ethno-state happens to be powerful enough to like dominate others, then that's what they're going to do. So given that we want to emphasize the importance of pluralism, how do we avoid this reduction to a kind of Machiavellian politics where these ethno-states, where we respect the differences among people, how do we avoid just a war of all against all, given that liberalism's idea of a global culture rooted in consumer capitalism, given that as the universal didn't work? How do we establish some sense of humanity that isn't dependent on these liberal constructs which clearly have failed? That's the leading edge of like what I'm struggling to find a way forward through.
The place I would look is where any of the systems were doing better or worse, right? That liberal capitalism wasn't uniform in its outcomes over time. Sometimes it was doing a better job, sometimes it was doing a worse job. Same with communism, same with every other system. When
Yeah.
were the renaissances happening? And what were the precipitating conditions within the limitations of any system that could be abstracted out and applied to our current situation? When you were saying that, I was thinking about, for me, the notion of a nation state is very problematic, but I'm interested in the hyphen, which is to say we've got states in the modern setup of the geopolitical situation, and we have this ideal of nations where a bunch of people share a common quasi-ethnicity and spirit of meaning. But we don't really have that. If you look at the states around the world, very few of them are typified by a general ethnicity. Right? One of the problems in the United States is at least two major nations keep vying for control of the state, maybe more than two, and as a result, the state doesn't get anywhere. And that's common everywhere, right? Should the Kurds have their own state to go with their nation? Should the Scottish nation separate from the British state? But on the other hand, how would you build a nation that accommodates the states that you have? Because there's two ways to solve the disparity. One would be to make a nation that fits existing states. The other would be to break states into the existing nations. You'd never do it perfectly. You could do it very generally. The problem with trying to make a nation that fits the existing states is that our only models for generating nationhood and ethnicities take a long time and involve a ton of violence over history. Right, to make Romans, to make the Spanish, right? It took a lot of time and a lot of people did a lot of terrible stuff. So we maybe don't have that time and we maybe don't want to be that brutal. So the alternative would be to break the states up somehow into things that are more approximate representations of existing nations. That might depressurize the situation to some degree because people within those blocks might have enough homogeneity to tolerate diversity. Right. And we might say, in terms of the all against all situation, that the all against all natural instinct is exacerbated where people can't rely on enough internal coherence to sustain the diversity. The novelty and complexity is anathema to them because they can't rely on a homogeneity that can sustain it, which they might be able to do in a healthy state that looked more like one nation. However, how are you going to do that? You'd have to convince every existing nation to change its operating protocol so that it's able to break down, break apart, reconstitute itself without losing its basic functions of economy and military protection and things like that. So whether you're making a nation to look like the state or a state to look like the nation, they both seem extremely improbable solutions. But we could look at trying to figure out a more advanced version of what actually enables people to work together. Right? If we have this idea that we're not just moving toward plurality, but that every type of identity within a plurality is created and evolved. They're not pre-given, right? We weren't metaphysically made to be Jewish from the beginning. We became Jewish over a long period of time because of a number of factors. And that tells us something about how anybody becomes a people. How is a people created? And I don't think it has to do specifically with nations or narratives. It has to do with whether they work together on common projects, whether they take pleasures in common, whether they suffer in common, and whether the subtypes within the groups mix with each other. And I think one of the things you see after the Second World War in the United States was a kind of Renaissance period from the end of the war to maybe the late 60s, where things just seemed to be getting more sophisticated and they were adapting faster than they had this 60s breakout thing. So was there something that went on during the war, in addition to just grabbing a bunch of the world's resources and having your enemies demolished, that helped them feel like they were a nation to the point where today, if someone says, "Make America Great Again," you're pretty sure they're talking about the post-war period. Somewhere between 1950 and 70. That's when we were great. So what went on there? One of the things that went on there was everybody was working on a common project. They had a common fear. They mixed together. You took people from the cities and the farms. You sent them to get more international experience. They came home more disciplined, better at teamwork, more aware of life and death values. You took the women out of the homes and moved them into the factories, right? You took people who were making pop cans and now they're making plane wings. There was a tremendous mixing of the races, the genders, and the classes that went on. And I think that's a huge part of how you get spirit. And if those groups are allowed to separate into their own little zones, then the fluids don't combine in a way that makes it electrically conductive, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah.
So you that guy, you can't just have it be separate. You'd have to force mixing somehow, because they'd have to do things together. Otherwise, they will just separate and polarized all against all camps.
Right. Yeah. The point that you're making about how like ethnicity or nationhood, or that sense of belonging to a people, is generated. It's not a pre-given essence that descends from eternity, but nor is it simply a social construct as if it's just not real or artificial. It's something in between. And it's another modern dichotomy, essentialism and constructivism, I guess. It's like the reality is that everything is a process, a historical process of construction. And the constructions that are produced by history are real and they can change. But there's a formula for change. There's work that needs to be done to produce, to maintain, and to change. And it's like we've trapped ourselves in this dichotomy. One of the contradictions in liberalism that's interesting to me, like liberal multiculturalism, is that like when England does its Brexit thing and says that it's a Anglo culture or whatever, liberals are all like, oh, that's like fascist or something. Meanwhile, if Israel does that, it's not. That's protecting a minority that has been persecuted, and that's fine. And I guess, they're historically different cultures, Jews and Anglo-Saxons or whatever, but there's just an inability for us to be consistent as in the liberal mindset with how we think about what a legitimate state is, or nation state is, and what isn't a legitimate nation state, based around these forms of identity. And it's like, it almost seems like we need to do two things at once, which is, yes, legitimize the desire that a people would have to maintain its sense of identity, and to find a way to communicate across those differences so that we can be respectful of one another. But then the difficulty becomes like, okay, so if Sharia law says that homosexual people or behaviors should be punishable by death, do we just allow that society to do that? It's like when who was he, the president of Iran years ago? I forget his name, but he came to the United States and gave a talk at some Ivy League school, and they were asking him what he thought about the persecution of gay people in Iran, and he said, "Oh, we don't have gay people in our country."
Ahmadinejad.
Ahmadinejad, yes, thank you. He's like, "Hey, we don't have gay people," and it's like, interesting perspective. So like, how do there are all these problems that come up. Like, we want to respect cultural difference, and yet there seems to be some need for a universal sense of like, look, we're human beings and we shouldn't kill each other over these seemingly petty things. And yet, for a traditional society, it's like, if it's not man, woman, marriage, children, family, that if anything outside that model is deeply threatening to the identity of that people, perhaps, right? So these are really wicked problems. When I'm feeling idealistic, I like to imagine that maybe the ecological crisis will be something that can bring us together because it transcends our cultural differences. But we can't even agree on the facts about whether there is an ecological crisis a lot of the time. So it's like, what will allow us to respect differences while also respecting something about the nature of the human being and our dignity as creative participants in society, such that you don't get the oppression of subgroups within a nation, you know.
It's a difficult problem in practice. In theory, you could say, well, what you need is a ranked integrative pluralism of some kind, right? You need to be able to embrace plurality, basically, but you also need to be able to draw gradations of health and value, which I think Nietzsche was doing. You know, it's what the Integral Project was. It's what the Metamodern Project is to some degree. You still have to be able to rank these things, right? We need a basis that we're comfortable with, where we can say about our society, hey, are we doing well or not on our own terms? And by the underlying logic of that same evaluation, we can look at another society and say, are they doing well or not on their own terms? Are they failing to be good Muslims or not, right? We may be able to make that criticism and go, hey, a healthy, strong, authentic Muslim society has a high degree of integration and voluntary cooperation among the types of its citizens, and not a high degree of antagonism and suppression among its citizens. It is not exemplified by a situation in which a lot of its young men think their best option is to destroy themselves and others in public places. That's a sign of failing to be Islamic properly, right? We might be able to want to say that in the same way we might want to say, if a similar thing is going on in America, it's failing to be America, right? So that we can have all this diversity, but we still have to have some way to be able to negotiate a value-based thing. And that value-based thing has got to be something like functionality and health, right? It can't be some really abstract, pure thing, right? We are able to say of any citizen in the world, regardless of their belief system and their ethnic reality tunnel, that they need hydration, that they need this complement of omega fatty acids. So we can say some things that are based on physiological health, but we can also expand that out. We know some things about emotional health. We know some things about neurological health. And then we also can know that those things have analogies in terms of social dynamics. So we want to be able to set a minimum standard of advanced well-being for people and be able to deploy that within any given cultural language. But that's all on the theory side. How do you actually make those interventions in the short, medium, and long term? Fundamentally, we're not even in a position to be able to regulate ourselves, let alone discern how we should be regulating ourselves or how we should be regulating anybody else. So the next pragmatic step is a very minimal change. We're not making some leap to the ideal society. Maybe that's a 200-year project. Where can we get in the next 20 years that keeps us from destruction and depressurizes, stabilizes, and enhances us in such a way that we're in a position to start making some more sophisticated changes that might be good for us and everyone else while honoring their differences.
Yep. I mean, this is why, as much as like I agree with like Marianne Williamson's critique of the medical model in this country, I still think we should have Medicare for all. Like, even though I'd be more worried about catching a disease or having a mistake made in a hospital than anything else. Like, I do not want to be in a hospital, but I still think everyone should have access to hospitals. And similarly with like, college being tuition free and universities being tuition free, like the university system right now is the way that disciplines are organized and funding and it's fucked. But I still think everyone should go to college and at least have the opportunity. Not everyone needs to go, but have the opportunity, regardless of their economic situation. And so it's like, yeah, there are very clear policy proposals that would move us to a situation where maybe our society is a little bit more viable 5 years from now, even if in 200 years we have a much more idealistic vision of how the knowledge economy and how health and things should be done differently. But yeah, I appreciate the sort of notion of internal ranking system that you're articulating there. I also think, though, that we've always been, the world system has always been such that these cultural pockets have been in relationship to one another, such that, like, can we say that suicide bombing suicide bombers is an internal failure of the Islamic world, well, that's a reaction to interference from the outside, from the United States and other, you know, colonial powers. So it's like I mean, it's an immune response to an outside invasion, you know. And so all of these cultures aren't self-contained, hermetically sealed, you know, entities. They're in relationship to one another, and they always have been. Like, you know, the West and Europe was always defining itself in opposition to, you know, the Islamic world, and it's not as though these differences have only arisen today, and this multicultural context has only arisen today. Like, the West was always already a hybrid, you know, of other cultural influences, and it, you know, like mystical Islam, Sufism, and mystical Christianity and Judaism, even, I think, well, so the Indian traditions precede all of this, right? Plato and Neoplatonism, it influenced, it's like the deep influence on Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It's like we all share this sense of like a core philosophical, metaphysical structure that informs what now seem like very different religious cultural perspectives. And so there's both like there's a deep unity underlying the plurality, and there's always been these tensions that cause each of these cultural pockets to evolve, to co-evolve with one another in response and often reaction to one another. You know, so that's an issue I have with Dugin's perspective about his version of pluralism is to each of the entities, the nation states or ethno-states that he imagines, the peoples he's imagining them as if they're totally like self-created. And from my perspective, we need a pluralism that's relational. Like, we've always been hybrids. We've always been either learning from one another or reacting against one another, and in a co-evolutionary process here.
There's no way to not be interactive.
Right.
There's especially in an age where your access to information is going to make you feel like you're involved in data coming from every part of the world all the time, right? You have that McLuhan-esque instantaneous thing.
Yeah.
So we're going to be more engaged with each other than ever, especially in the face of crises we need to handle as a planet. But like you're saying, from the beginning of time, no group has ever not been changed by and in connection with other groups. Mm-hmm. So it's a matter of how to do that well, which is partly how do the groups relate to each other, and largely is the group internally anti-fragile enough, adaptable enough, self-confident enough, self-consistent enough to be strong, to be healthy, and to be able to handle its relationships with others in a way that's productive for itself. Right? So, I mean, there's two sides of a thing, right? You say, well, you can't just critique somebody's structural health on the inside because there's external factors that lead them to be that way, which is true. And somebody gets hit by a car and the paramedics show up, but they do treat it like, hey, our first thing is you have an internal organization problem, which is you're bleeding out of your belly. Yeah. Now, there is an external reason that happens, but the first thing we have to do is handle it as an internal structure problem, because that puts you in, that stabilizes you. Once you're stabilized, then we can start to think about, well, maybe cars shouldn't be in that situation, or maybe that driver should be prosecuted. And that health and stabilization, in a way, is the first step down a process that leads you to being anti-fragile, where each of these systems could be said to be healthy only in the degree to which it is capable of handling its external relations to other groups in a way that is profitable to the well-being of its internal groups. Right? So, like, if you were to say, you know, assuming we buy the conventional scenario where Al-Qaeda attacked the United States, if their goal was to repel American intervention in Afghanistan, their goal colossally failed, right? Nothing provoked more American engagement in Afghanistan than that. It literally invited the foreign hordes onto their soil in incalculable mass amounts. So that's, in a way, that's a failure from that internal point of view relative to that external thing. It didn't necessarily produce the results they wanted, if we say those are the results they wanted.
It seems
But
to
that's
me
a
that
kind of analytical frame you can use in each situation and go, did our external situation did that relationship yield the kind of results that our internal situation wants? If not, our internal situation isn't quite where we want it to be. And therefore we could say it is insufficiently healthy, insufficiently robust in that sense.
yeah, I mean, I'm a pragmatist and a consequentialist, so it's like the guide for action isn't some preconceived ideological notion, but what were the consequences of this action? How did it play out? Did we end up getting what we wanted? I mean, in the case of Al Qaeda, it seems like the goal was to precipitate the war to bring about the end of the world. I mean, so they got what they wanted, which was more American intervention.
So you could say of that's unhealthy in the sense that that group was trying to precipitate a situation disastrous for itself. That's a quasi-suicidal move, which lots of cultures engage in. Right? Arguably, the Nazis were engaged in a quasi-suicidal move.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we'd have to bring some Muslims in to talk to us about that, because it's not clear what the motivations were in that particular case.
Yeah, it's very debatable what even happened, let alone why it happened.
Right. Yeah.
But we need something that enables us to evaluate how we're doing and enables us to evaluate how others are doing without depriving them of their right to be different than us. And that thing can't be totally arbitrary. It has to be grounded in something that is universal. And we're not going to be perfect in making that evaluation, but it has to be something like the thrivability of humans in an ecosystem. So it's health-like, whatever this evaluation is, but it's health considered multidimensionally. And in the integral sense, part of health is it available to evolutionary development? Right, so that a system is, one of the reasons a system is unhealthy is if it's blocking the unforced migration of its own citizens to more complicated and deeper levels of richness of understanding of their culture. And the more people are allowed to move through without being forced to move through or blocked from moving through, the more likely they are to enter into more sophisticated relational exchanges with other groups, which consist of people who also have more people who've moved through to more sophisticated levels.
Right.
Again, that's way down the road.
Right. And it's like we don't necessarily have that much more time I like the idea of like each cultural unit needs to own its own shit, like, and we all need to do that simultaneously to short circuit this action reaction, historical revenge of like violence cycle that we're in. And with the ecological crisis bearing down on us, there's going to be resource shortages, food shortages, mass migration. Like, it's going to be, if there's going to be, it's going to be easier and easier to blame one another for the downward spiral of our planetary situation. And so it's like, if this transformation doesn't happen quickly, I don't know if this cascading set of catastrophes is going to catapult us into that, or just decimate the civilization as we've known it, and prepare the ground for 1,000 years from now, maybe something will arise that can remember what went wrong and try something else. So it's like, I don't know if we're in the phase now where we have to let go of so much of the present situation, the present level of civilization, in order to make room for something far into the future, or whether there is something to be salvaged and that we don't want to let go of, like the platform that we've established, because we'll just fall too far down.
There's absolutely a lot of stuff we want to salvage, right? And modernity has many beautiful factors when it's operating at its best. And if we were to lose it and have to rebuild it, that's a lot of wasted time, and a lot of horror is going to come along with that. But it's also self-destabilizing and destabilizing the whole system by its attempt to hold on. Right? So I think, it's very easy to look at the American political situation in, developmental politics terms and go, well, there's the traditionalist modern and postmodern value systems arguing with each other, and these are the Republicans, Democrats, and progressives. But is that really what they are, or are we looking now at three different responses to a civilization crisis? And the groups represent people who want to accelerate the crisis and destabilize civilization by overtly mismanaging it, people who want to slow down and try to maintain control of the situation by restoring the civilization, which is causing the destabilization, or the people who want to adapt to upgrade solutions that might put us on the other side of the crisis. Mm-hmm. And the biggest group by far is the group of, let's slow the crisis and restore stabilization. But they're trying to use methods that cause destabilization. So it may be that you have no choice but to weaken the grip of the current civilization system. And in that sense, there's a kind of alliance between postmodernists and traditionalists, in the same sense that there has to be an alliance between left and right tendencies at any level of development against the middle. Because if the status quo holds, the status quo is going to break the whole system. It's very scary to think about allying with regressives.
Yeah.
But you need to ally with somebody against the center, because the center is choking us, essentially. And we're not going to be able to upgrade if the center doesn't let go. Now, when the center let go, you don't know if you're going to get an upgrade or a regression. But at the same time, you absolutely are going to get a regression if the center doesn't let go, because its chokehold and self-destabilization leads to regressive pre-modern cultural outbursts, which indicate that modernity is not holding on, that it is destroying itself to some degree. And unless you can pry its cold, dead hand off the gun, we're not even in a position where we have a chance to make the upgrade that would allow us to move through this situation with continuity, as opposed to having to reboot civilization over the next 1,000 years.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I certainly agree. I'd rather not destroy the evolutionary achievements that have accumulated thus far. And, just let me be a little bit more specific about the situation you were describing in terms of Republicans, Democrats, and progressives. It seems like we're in a situation right now where, my personal view is Biden is a neoliberal that will continue the austerity practices that create the conditions for neo-fascism. Trump is a neo-fascist. And so I would rather have the Biden neoliberal approach to an actual neo-fascist, even though I know that we're just continuing to fertilize the soil for the Nazis with the neoliberal austerity approach. The bigger problem seems to be that our whole, as you said, there's the non-voters, which is the majority. And only, I think, 28% of Americans are Democrats and like 24% or something are Republicans. And so that's like, we've allowed the minority to, of the population to wrestle control over the electoral system. And I'm wondering, it goes back to ritual technologies again. Our form of representationalist government, whereby every 4 years we participate in the miracle of not transubstantiation, but representation. And somehow our collective will is magically funneled into these representative figures who, go to the White House or to Congress and execute our will. Nobody believes that anymore. We don't believe in that ritual technology of voting in our constitutional system is completely, I won't say completely, we still go through the motions, but nobody really believes in it anymore. Nobody believes that the will of the people is translating into legislative action, right? It's completely broken. And so it seems like, some people are calling, and it's not new in American history, but more and more people are calling for a constitutional convention. Article 5 of the Constitution lays out the procedure here. It hasn't been done since the Constitution itself was framed. That was the last convention, but I think our mutual friend Ari Allen is trying to work on something like this, and it's a dangerous thing to call a convention, because then anything's on the table, and there are some people who would like to see us move more in the direction of a theocracy. That's like the Mike Pences of the world, and then there are lots of more progressive people, and there's the whole tech sector that would love us to move to voting by app, where you have a representative who, before they cast a vote in the legislative body, needs to check in with their constituents who will vote on their app on whatever the issue is. And then that representative is legally bound to actually follow through with the will of the constituents, as they have made that will known through their little voting apps, right? Seems like an improvement to me. There's probably some unforeseen side effects, but in any event, it seems like we need to reimagine our electoral rituals, because there's always an element of magical participation here, whereby, baby deer, there's an element of magical participation here, whereby our will is translated into a larger national governmental entity. And if we don't think that process, that ritual process, is legitimate, then the society is not going to function. And so it seems to me like to preserve a democratic form of self-governance, we really need to re-examine the whole process by which we elect our representatives. On the other hand, I don't even know if the national government, the federal government, is the ideal locus of power for a country as large as the United States. And so maybe we can figure out some way of translating the will of the people to that federal level, but maybe the federal government, as the conservatives have always been saying, needs to shrink, and the state governments need to step in to fill some of that void, because this is a diverse country. And I don't know that even if we had a better process by which we elected our representatives, that we'd be able to get along.
The American situation is uniquely problematic because both the state and the federal level interfere with each other. So you really, either you should have a stronger state level and decrease federal government, or a stronger federal government and decreased state level. But unless you have one of those two things, you're going to end up with both of them interfering with each other, which is a great idea if you wanted to block the return of the English king in the 1700s, but a terrible idea if you want to handle the economy and face a health crisis.
Yeah.
And since the crises are going to keep coming, one way or another, the system has to be able to stop interfering with itself. And seemingly it can't do that. It has to be fixed, like we were saying, at the level of popular spirit, which has this religious cultural dimension, and at the systems by which we reach decisions together politically. And those are kind of, interlinked, because you need the people to mobilize in a common spirit in order to vote and try to get their feeling registered in the system. But if the system isn't smart enough to upload their energy, then they're going to feel thwarted, in which case they're not going to make that move of trying to be involved. So there's an interlocking circuit there, which I think we just have to analyze as two separate pieces. One is, how do you make the voting system, how do you make the general social system better at uploading the will of the people? And on the other hand, how do you produce a will of the people? I think always of, there's a passage in Jean-Jacques Rousseau where he says, voting is like gambling, right? That the French people have a spirit, and when you vote, if you vote in a way that wasn't the outcome of the election, you just gambled wrong on what the will of the people was. it was correct. The election is always correct.
Yeah.
Which is not a dumb thing to say, but it's dumb if the procedure of voting has no chance of actually uploading the will of the people, right? That in a plurality vote, 30% of the people win the election or something like that. That's what's going on here because we have multiple parties up north. Same thing. If slightly more people vote for a conservative over a liberal and most people don't vote, and the interests of the people, the issues they are concerned about don't translate into legislation, and they only do this ritual once every 4 years and they always feel bad afterwards, in what sense is any of that uploading the will of the people? So you've got to change that somehow, right? And there's all kinds of ways you could do that, right? You got to fix the gerrymandering. You've got to make a voting holiday. You've got to make it easy to vote. Why isn't everybody automatically registered? Why are we doing simple majority? Why aren't we taking averages or doing a ranked choice ballot or something like that? If we have secret ballot in the general population, why don't we have secret ballot in the houses of legislature so that their external sponsors can't tell whether they voted the way they want them to vote or not? There's all kinds of things you could do as soon as you get the idea of how does the process achieve higher fidelity in collecting group intelligence and outputting it into an actionable decision. That's a whole area of thought that people have only really just started to do. But at the same time, you have to mobilize the people first to get into power to make the changes that could upgrade the system of power. So how do you do that? Well, first you need people and a party and policies, but upstream of that, you need some kind of spirit they can agree on that they can use to vet that process. Like if you elect somebody who's a very charismatic candidate and wins the election, but doesn't represent the spirit of the party, what good was it? I mean, absolutely, you've got to choose Joe Biden over Trump because you got to get Trump out of the way for the war to begin. But the war is against people like Joe Biden because they either don't represent what the Democratic Party was supposed to be, or the Democratic Party itself is now the interference in the system.
Yeah. There's this vicious cycle in the United States where people who are good-hearted and intelligent tend to shun politics because of how corrupt it is, which means that only the corrupt people end up going into politics. And so the decay gets worse and worse. And, you know, one of the most disappointing, deflating, frustrating aspects of Bernie's primary campaign both years, in 2016 and 2020, was that the youth vote did not turn out. They voted like they normally do at like 20%. And of the eligible voters under 30 voted in the primaries for Bernie. And it's like, there's already a lack of participation among people over 30 and people under 30 who they've just given up on the system, it seems like. And so the system gets worse and worse, you know? And so it seems to me that until we address the legitimization crisis, the sense that people do not feel that their representatives are representing them, then we're not going to get people involved in politics, and there's going to continue. I mean, the Trump administration has drained out any of the remaining brains that were in these federal agencies. They've all fled, you know, and there was already a brain drain before Trump. People don't want to go into government, you know, and so it becomes more and more corrupt, and it becomes more and more governed by corporate interests. And so it's like a self-perpetuating decay process. And so it's like, how do we get people excited about the difficult, messy process of self-governance? I think we need to really, all the things you mentioned, runoff voting and ranked choice and a parliamentary system, so that there's a need to form coalition governments. I know that can be messy, but it's better than the polarity that we have now, where nothing gets done. So I do think that there's a need for, under the current constitutional order, a constitutional convention invoking Article 5. It's I think it's worth the risk of, all the other interests that are going to come into that convention saying, oh, well, we want to do this and this and this. It's like, okay, well, let's hash that out. If the very terms of the system are brought into question for possible amendment, I hope that the people that right now shun politics will realize, oh, this is an opportunity, and if we could get at least a majority of the American population concerned with the construction of a new form of government, then we have a chance. But if we don't, then we're fucked. I don't think we can recover from Trump, whether it was Biden or Bernie. If Bernie was the president that came after Trump, if we did manage to get him elected, the more I thought about it, it wouldn't have done any good. Congress would have obstructed everything.
It's only if something like that were to happen. But it's the same thing with the constitutional switch up there. And I'm a strong supporter of Ari's project. And the framers of that project would have to set it up in such a way that the different people who came in as factions would have to provide solutions to particular problems and not just try to foist their belief system on the process. But even then, it's the beginning of a fight, right? The same as if you were to elect Sanders. It's only the beginning of a fight. Mm-hmm. So people have got to understand that this is a multi-front battle that's going to go on forever. It's not a simple thing to solve. It requires a deep moral commitment and an awareness that the rest of our lives, this battle is going to be going on, even at the level of trying to stabilize our society in the face of climatic and economic destabilization around the world. That's going to be happening. It's already happening. That's not something that's going to get fixed in 5 or 10 or even 20 years. So we need to teach each other the ethic of a lifelong struggle in this regard that's going to go ahead on multiple fronts simultaneously, just as the bare minimum moral commitment to being in the system that we're in. And that's a disheartening thing unless we embrace it. We'll say, look, yes, of course, it sucks. It's not going to change fast. We're going to fight forever. That's just aggressive. So whenever you hear anything that makes it sound like it's not going to change soon, that's fine. We understand already. We're not destabilized by that. It reinforces our idea that we're committed to an ongoing battle. The same as anybody in religion is committed to, an endless jihad in the direction that we think is the higher direction. Mm. You need to mobilize people fast, though, to make some minimal changes that make the system able to be changed more. And you have to do that by piggybacking on emergent mobilizations within the population. You can't wait until there's just enough of all the right people. You have to say, what are they crying out for now? What are they in the streets about? And this is where some version of progressive comes in. It's not the right solution. It's the slightly better solution that we could get to put us in a place where we could consider better solutions. Something that would just, on the one hand, create policies that were a little bit more universalist and depressurizing, but on the other hand, make it apparent to people that something could happen. Because if we think in terms of the modern system being locked in and, causing the system to shake by trying to keep it from shaking, that thing's got to be removed to some degree, and anything that upsets that has value, right? It's totally legit that people voted Trump, because they know the system's got to be shaken up. Now, it turned out he's a completely incompetent, regressive, neo-fascist fool who doesn't even want to govern and is backed by a bunch of people who are actively pulling all the wiring out of the system and causing it to regress. That was the result. But the motive to shake it up, to vote for something against the established order, is a good motive. And if you get a constitutional amendment, you get a new constitution, you get a socialist leader, you'd make a voting change. Who knows if it's the right voting change? You tried something, and that something's going to shake it up. Any new approach to voting is going to make us smarter about voting approaches. And we're currently really dumb about voting approaches. Yes. Anything that mixes it up at this point is a step forward, because we honestly don't have a lot to lose if modernity is choosing between rapid deconstruction of its own processes or slow choking itself to death.
Yeah. I mean, to be partisan for a second here, it seems to me to be the case that if the Republicans weren't gumming up the works of the Voting Rights Act, and if we had a truly federal level, I know, sorry, I keep saying we as if I know you're Canadian, so
Close
uh,
enough.
you live in the nice apartment above the meth lab is one way I heard it put. But the Republicans are with the gerrymandering and the each state, particularly in the South, that prevents mostly Black people and Latino people from voting. If that were all cleaned up, the Republicans would never win a fucking election again because of the demographic change in this country. And so they're holding on for dear life, knowing that. And so just voting reform, a simple national policy. You're registered to vote when you're 18 by default, just like we can register people for the selective service. And, you know, you vote by mail. And simple. And then I think so much of the gum in the works now would be cleaned out just by doing that. We'd still have problems to solve, but we'd have the ability to solve them. Whereas now we don't. So partisanship on that issue is essential. And it's one of the reasons that I think people need to vote for Joe Biden, even though he's not a solution to any of our problems. He's at least for voting rights.
It's a tricky thing to evaluate that because, you know, on the one hand, absolutely, vote for Joe Biden over Trump. But like people say, vote for wallpaper over Trump. Does Joe Biden mean anything he says? Right? Because on the one hand, you think, well, yes, Democrats are going to manage the system a little better. And that might put it in a position where it can start to make its changes a little better. And that's absolutely what we need to do, because all we can do is make small upgrades that move us towards a position where we can make big upgrades. And once Joe Biden's in there, or whoever, you have the Democratic playing field is the battlefield in which the struggle for progress takes place, right? If there's going to be a war against liberal modernity coming from some kind of meta-progressive place, that only takes place where liberal modernity is up front and stabilized. Essentially you need a Democrat for progressives to go to war with. Until the Republican is out of the way, the war doesn't start. But
right.
How deeply sophisticated and entrenched and polarized is modernity itself, right? Do we consider Republicans or conservatives to be an oppositional force to liberal Democrats or an inherent part of the liberal democratic modern system? Are they the protection wall around Democrats, which allow them to never really make those changes? Right? You can always go like, hey, there's this gross version. You don't want that. You want us. You flip back and forth. But as soon as the centrists are in charge, they go, well, we can't really actually make those changes. We got to split the difference with our conservative friends. We'd really like to pass these changes, but all we're going to do is slightly undo the changes that the conservatives made. And I know we promised you we'd really get that done, but you got to just be moderate and understand this is a long incremental process, and there's currently bigger fish to fry. And I mean, that's the argument to vote for Joe Biden. There's currently a situation with Trump. You've got to get rid of him. But there's always currently a situation, which means we can't make the changes from that point of view. So we have to be careful. I mean, obviously, vote Biden over Trump, sure. But is that a vote for those changes, or is that a vote for the system in which those changes never get made?
Yeah. I mean, I tend to call it the corporate duopoly, because there's definitely a way in which the two major parties work together to maintain the existing capitalist system of corporate control. There's no doubt about that. And there's no doubt that the way that the corporate duopoly has sort of created this, it's a form of social engineering, I think, this polarity around certain social issues. They agree on economics almost across the board. They're hashing out a difference of a few $100s now with this unemployment check thing, but it's like the basics of neoliberal austerity are across both parties. I mean, they all agree on that. But there are these issues, social issues like abortion or gay marriage or whatever, where they really disagree, civil rights, increasingly, Trump has, I think, pushed that difference more to the foreground, the civil rights stuff, which is good because it shows there's some daylight between the two parties where it does make sense, I think, to try to get more Democrats elected, even if at the end of the day, it's still a corporate duopoly. And the real issue here is money in politics and the way that capitalism has subsumed the political sphere into itself as just another, another part of the corporation that requires some funding to make sure that it operates correctly. We desperately need a third party to bring people who have disaffected voters back into the fold. I think right now in the last election, was it Gary Johnson of the Libertarians? He got more votes than Jill Stein, I think, the Green Party candidate. I'm pretty sure, like twice as many or more. So clearly the Green Party is not going to do it. The Libertarian Party's got a little bit more momentum. Can we join forces and have a Libertarian Eco-Socialist Party? I mean, there's something out there that needs to coalesce to challenge the corporate duopoly. I don't know what form it will take, but I do hope that we can find new ways of languaging our values so that what Bernie was proposing doesn't get dismissed as, like Castro's communism, but instead can be recognized as an American tradition going back to, Eugene V. Debs. And like, this isn't some foreign imposition of a Soviet ideology onto good old fashioned capitalist America. It's like, no, this is homegrown stuff. And the people that tend to vote for Republicans, working class white people, would benefit from some of these policies tremendously. And so we just need to find ways of building alliances. And a lot of it has to do with the languaging. Bernie could have done a much better job communicating not only to potential Trump voters or people who did actually vote for Trump, working class people, but a better job communicating to older black voters too. Because, he didn't, and also to younger voters. I mean, that's where most of his support came from, but they still didn't turn out. So like it's a PR issue, I think, because if people understood the sorts of policies and programs in the direction that, Bernie wanted to move the country, if they understood it in terms of their own values and saw how they would benefit from it, it would have been a runaway, so.
I mean, when I say there's a multi-front battle that has to go on, right? It's meta progressives have to clarify their principles. Popular spirit has to be built up in the country. You have to fight from within the existing parties, and you have to create a new party. Like, we've got to be doing all of those things all the time. Yeah. When we come to the idea of how you would run an alternative political campaign more successfully, and there was a lot of success in this last cycle, right? If we're constellated around a group of policies that involve an upgrade to the systems we're using now for everyone's well-being and to prepare ourselves for shocks that are coming down the pipeline at us inevitably, how do we do that? Well, we have that kind of policy core. You've got to add in some messaging that hits more of those conservative and traditional themes. You've got the young people on side, but you need to mobilize them, right? It's like for George Bush's election, they were busing people from the churches. You've got to do something like that, right? It's not enough to get the young people on board. They're lazy. You have to take them to the polling booth. That's that part. But there's these different strategies. Bernie's Latino strategy worked very well. All right, there's other strategies he had to make better alliances. It turns out he had to reach out to older black voters and middle-class white voters differently. He might have needed to be more aggressive, right? Maybe he should have been hard attacking Joe Biden the whole time, and maybe he's not the kind of guy that could do that. They need to be taking positions that are broadly popular and making it seem exciting to mobilize people. And they were doing that to some degree, but they need a bunch more people on side, and it is to some degree a marketing problem. But what's the solution to the marketing problem is, on the one hand, to double down on what you're doing. Like, it's great that he called himself a socialist because it shows you're not afraid, right? It shows you're not flinching from popular critique. And Trump had that as well. In an age where the media is completely unreliable and everybody changes their mind all the time, and the surface of the social culture seems toxic and nonsensical, a person who doesn't back away from things demonstrates a strength that we need in our leader. But they've also got to supplement that with a shout out to the ethos of the other side. It's not like we need to take 50% conservative or traditionalist policies and unite them with progressive policies. But we do need to take maybe 50% of their style and a couple of their concerns and foreground that stuff. It needs to seem a little bit more militaristic and aggressive and concerned about borders, a little bit more oriented toward us protecting our land and our traditions. And I think if you had that, you could start to build that coalition farther out into the working class people who would actually be benefited by these policies and are actually currently suffering from the current set of options. But it's hard to bring them in if they don't hear an ethos that they can relate to. Mm-hmm. Right? If you want to get them in on the Green New Deal, that's something like defend your land. It's not something like I believe in cosmopolitan ecology. Right. So I think you give the concept of the policy to the progressives, and you give the flavor of the marketing to the old school traditionalist conservative element. And nobody's going to be happy with that. But I think you have to go forward with that unhappy coalition in order to start building the aesthetic on which a new group spirit is built.
Definitely.
This is my fantasy: is after the first 3 primary elections, Bernie suddenly vanishes, and then he shows up on the battlefield in Afghanistan on the front lines. And you see him with soldiers, you see him there aggressively. Doesn't matter if you want to cover Joe Biden at that point. You can't resist putting that on CNN. All he has to do is be there for an hour and fly back, because stunts, because symbolism, because not just giving speeches and having policies. You're speaking to the collective unconscious.
You're right. He totally didn't drive the narrative about his campaign. He didn't create the conversations. He was more reactive. And he let the corporate media and the other candidates set the terms of the debate. He let Elizabeth Warren set the terms of the debate. He wasn't media savvy enough. As he was, he recognized he needed to create his own sort of media infrastructure, which he did. Some of the videos, but nobody saw these videos, but he, would go to impoverished communities and sit and talk with people, for hours about their situation. And he didn't even say much. He was just asking them questions about their lives and then saying, look, these people matter. These people matter. Your story matters. Your suffering matters. And I thought that was really effective, but it didn't penetrate.
He did a lot of things really well, right?
Yeah.
So we got to give him credit for stuff like that. He tried to make their own ecosystem. For an old Jewish guy and self-declared socialist to come out of almost nowhere in most people's minds and temporarily be the front runner, that's amazing, right? Yeah. To turn out that Latino vote, to be going on Fox News and getting ovations. He handled a lot of stuff really well, but there's an equally large number of things that he didn't handle really well.
Yeah. Yes, the latest poll that was done back in April showed that now 69%, this was in April, so I can only imagine with the pandemic that it's gone up, but 69% of Americans are in favor of Medicare for all now. And that's the question was, are you in favor of Medicare for all, single payer healthcare? 69% say yes. 88% of Democrats yes, and it's something like 38 or 40% of Republicans. So that's a huge accomplishment that I think Bernie deserves credit.
He put that on the table for us.
Yeah, and well, you already have it up there, but
well, ours is not as good as the one he's proposing.
Oh, really? So he's definitely moved the Overton window, but the problem is, even with 88% of Democrats in favor of that policy, the Democratic Party ain't going to do it. you know?
Right. So
That's the
what is
disconnect.
power?
Yeah. Yeah.
And some of it is changing systems, but you got to get elected to change systems.
Right.
Some of it is, I mean, a lot of people were saying this around the time that he dropped out, that he should have been more aggressive, that he should have attacked more. You know, maybe he should have used television more. But I think progressives have a hard time leaning into the power game, taking it seriously on its own terms and being willing to be attacked. Right? A standard thing that liberals do against progressives is say, well, sure, we'd like to do that, but you're not being reasonable or nice. Why
Yeah.
don't you get on side and stop being so mean and so extreme? And you know, and so they're asking you to back away from your position. Why don't you take half of your own position? Aren't the people who are supporting you not being nice to people on the internet? Shouldn't you apologize? Shouldn't you demonstrate symbolic subservience to our concerns?
Yeah.
What are you supposed to do in that situation? It's tricky because you are nice. Progressives are very sensitive, nice people on the whole. But that's a moment where you have to attack, where you have to double down, which is what Trump was doing in his 2016 campaign. You go for it. If they're worried, if they're unhappy and upset by what you're doing, that's good. That's a win. That means their power structure is being disturbed. They're no longer just thinking you're frivolous. They're worried they might have to change their structure. But
Yeah.
when they're expressing that worry, that means you're doing something correct and should do that more intensely.
Yeah. I was disappointed with Bernie's capitulation to that narrative, apologizing and telling his supporters, don't be so mean. It's like, why are you letting it? Again, he's letting the corporate media set the terms of the debate rather than doing what Trump has done, which has proven so successful, which is to give them the fucking finger, because Americans love that. And, you know, it's as if people forgot how vitriolic the primaries were when Obama and Hillary were running against each other. Oh my God, so much worse than anything that Bernie's people said about Warren or about the DNC. So much worse. You know, just go back and watch some of the debates. And, you know, Hillary was pushing, her campaign was pushing ads online saying that Obama was potentially a Muslim. That was her campaign. I mean, come on. So it's like very short-term memories. And Bernie should have just said, you know, what's mean is letting millions of people die every year unnecessarily because we don't have a sane healthcare system in this country.
This is an interesting thing in terms of integral theory and stuff like that, because I think it relates to shadow dynamics in the
Hmm.
social context,
Hmm.
right? Which is when you're dealing with shadow material, you have to experience it and be upset by it, but then own it, integrate it into the ego to some degree. So when a shadow narrative surfaces in the society, the natural thing for a good person to do is try to disagree with that. But also, that shows weakness and doesn't give you conceptual ownership of the energy represented by your own shadow.
Hmm.
Right? You have to accept it. You have to lean into it. You say whatever they throw at you, you go yes, absolutely, and then you spin it, right? But
Yeah.
don't you have an army of Bernie bros? You go yes, I do, and here's what that means.
Right.
Something right? You gotta, or same like you were saying. Here's what's actually mean is doing this.
Mm-hmm.
You agree to it and then you spin it back to your values. But what you don't do is capitulate to it or distance yourself from it, because that's a demonstration of weakness in the
Exactly.
collective public psyche.
Yeah. Yeah. So he was too nice on that. Hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, we could do postmortem on the Bernie campaign all day, which it's a valuable exercise because we're not going to have a constitutional convention tomorrow, and we're going to have to deal with the same primary process.
There's going to be endless elections, and we have to learn from what happens.
Yeah.
One of those learnings is you should be worrying the liberal establishment. When they
Yeah.
express their concern, that's a win.
Right. Yeah. I think we should probably start to wrap up, but I read I think it was an article in, was it The Hill or Politico? I think it was The Hill, comparing this election to the 1980 election, where Carter lost to Reagan, but they're saying that now the thing is reversed, so that Trump is Carter, and it's a way in which the conservative revolution, political revolution, to use Bernie's term, that happened when Reagan was elected. It seems like now the way American politics works, like this seesaw pendulum swing, we're swinging in the opposite direction potentially, which if Joe Biden and the neoliberal order becomes the new right wing, basically, then there's a real chance for a generation's worth of progressive movement in the kind of direction we like to see. And so I just read this article last night, and it really gave me a sense of hope that, okay, this, assuming the polling is accurate right now, it seems like Trump is going to be demolished, especially in the Electoral College, because Biden's doing well in all the swing states. And so, this might be a real pivot point into a different set of rules, and a different political spectrum, where the reactionary right just really overplayed its hand, and there's a revolutionary left that can overplay its hand sometimes too. But I think the center of gravity of the country has shifted enough. I think, and Bernie played an important role there, that we can see how what's going on in Portland and in Seattle. It's like, okay, there might be a little bit of an overreach there, and it's provoking the neo-fascist response. But I think most people realize that we can forgive that, because the right wing reactionaries that are flooding the executive branch with Trump in power are dangerous enough that these sorts of tactics are maybe appropriate. But anyways, I just have this sense of hope that perhaps the pendulum is going to swing in the opposite direction, and we'll be in a completely different game in the next 4 years. So we'll see. We'll see what happens.
That's a nice scenario. I think, to be anti-fragile, what we have to have is a strategy that works no matter what happens. So we're not waiting passively to see how the pendulum swings, but if it goes this way, we do this. If it goes this way, we do this. Right? If the election turns out like this, we have a strategy. If it turns out like this, we have a strategy to get to the same place.
Right.
And I think, it's very high likelihood Joe Biden's going to win. And that's a reasonably good scenario for a more radical politics, especially a more radical progressive politics, because we have massive challenges we need to face. And there's something like an army of people out there in the country waiting to be mobilized with no clear leader at the moment. They're taking to the streets on their own. They're very passionate. And I think if they could if the progressive side could take a 25% bite out of the revolutionary conservative side, it would be in a strong position to counterbalance some of its own tendencies and move forward aggressively to become a new kind of center.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And the resistance against neo-fascism is essential right now. And if and when Biden is elected, the resistance against the neoliberal norm must continue. I think that's one of the things that I've been trying, as I try to convince people who I know don't want to hear it that they should vote for Biden. I couch it in, vote for Biden because the resistance will continue against an enemy that's less likely to shoot you in the street, So I'm kind of running with that narrative. The resistance continues, and Biden is a more worthy enemy, right, than Trump.
Yeah, that's what I usually say. I mean, I suggest to people it's good to threaten to not vote for Biden. You should do everything you can to worry them.
Right.
But the war doesn't start until Biden is elected.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah.
I wish we'd talked more about God, but maybe next time.
Next time. That sounds good. This has been a lot of fun, very interesting ideas. Appreciate everything that you shared. It's helping me digest some of the problems that I was sitting with, and let's do this again. And Yeah, I appreciate your mind.
Yeah, I've had a nice time. Really enjoyed talking with you, Matt. And let's absolutely do it again.
Awesome.
Cheers.
All right, Layman. Take care.